Muted.
Thank you. Just started the recording.
Great. Thank you, Tom. Hello, everyone. I'm Jess Guerrier. I am the Director of Learning and Practice with the Sustainability Curriculum Consortium, or SCC. And first off, I want to thank everyone for being here, for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for today's webinar, our first in the series on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development for Higher Education Professionals. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. We've been delighted so far at the SCC with the positive responses to our invitations to these webinars on various topics, and we've seen great participation in our online dialogue so far, and we're expecting more of the same on the call today. As a reminder, the recorded transcripts of these webinars, today's webinar and those to follow in this SDG series, will be available online on the YouTube channel for the SCC. And at the SCC, we're developing a consortium to support college and university teaching faculty in education for sustainability, education for sustainable development. We have more information about those plans in our current newsletter, and as we're approaching our strategic planning, we'll be inviting your input. Now is a great time for you to get in touch with the SCC. We're always interested in two main questions. What are your biggest challenges in teaching sustainability, and what are your greatest needs in order to successfully prepare the next generation of sustainability leaders? You can check out our website for more details about our mission, our partners, and our upcoming programs, and also to send us feedback. And that website is curriculumforsustainability.com. I will hand things over at this point briefly to Ira, who will explain the online dialogue process, and then I will introduce our speakers for today's webinar.
Thank you, Jess. For all of you on the line registered for this online dialogue series on the 2030 Development Agenda, you should already understand that this is not a standalone webinar. For us at the Sustainability Curriculum Consortium, our online dialogue is a multi-component process. It combines key readings that we identify up front with input from our expert presenters. We, of course, have in this online dialogue a series of 3 expert-led webinars. After each webinar, the discussion on the topics covered will continue on our Collaborate platform. Our presenters and other experts and all registered participants will have the ability to log on to Collaborate and participate in that facilitated Q&A. You all should have received a separate email, separate from your log on to the webinar, an invitation from Collaborate that gives you access to that Q&A that will follow on the Collaborate platform. Finally, at the end of this online dialogue process, and you should be aware that we have scheduled beginning today and then every other week on the Tuesdays, the follow-on webinars. At the end of the process, with all the information that has been shared with the key readings and the webinars and the follow-on Q&A, we'll all co-create in wiki style a synthesis document on the Collaborate platform, and we'll all be able to use that for our own purposes in our own curriculum and course activities. So we intend in the content part of the Sustainability Curriculum Consortium's activities to utilize these online dialogues to offer sustainability educators a quick and credible means to become conversant with emerging trends, frameworks, and hot topics, and to keep pace with developments in sustainability. With that, we will now turn it back to Jess for introductions of today's presenters. Thanks, Jess.
Thanks, Ira. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Kevin Noone is professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Analytical Chemistry, or ACES, at Stockholm University in Sweden. He has a background in chemical engineering and civil and environmental engineering, oceanography, meteorology, and atmospheric physics. From 2004 to 2008, he was the executive director of the International Geosphere-Biosphere Program, or IGBP. His primary research interests are in the area of atmospheric chemistry and physics, the effects of aerosols and clouds on air quality and the Earth's climate, and sustainability science. He's a co-author of the seminal Rockstrom paper on planetary boundaries. And Kevin has headed up a number of large international field experiments and is or has been a member of a number of international communities and boards. He chaired the European Academy's Science Advisory Council's Environmental Steering Panel from 2008 to 2012, was the vice chair of the International Group of Funding Agencies, or IGFA, from 2010 to 2014, and is currently chair of the Transdisciplinary Advisory Board for the European Joint Programming Initiative on Climate. Kevin is active in conveying science to stakeholders and the general public. He regularly gives presentations and short courses on climate and sustainability issues for non-science audiences. Following Kevin, we have Faye Leone. She is a researcher, writer, and content editor for Sustainable Development Policy and Practice, which is a publication of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, or IISD, reporting services. Faye was a member of the IISD Earth Negotiations Bulletin Team during the SDG process at the UN, and was previously with the World Federalist Movement Institute for Global Policy, where she managed 2 popular websites and published updates on the UN elections and appointments, as well as reform in such areas as gender architecture, environmental governance, and expanding the Security Council. From 2000 to 2004, she worked for the Earth Rights International in Thailand, developing and managing a conflict transformation program, providing staff training on conflict transformation and consensus decision-making, conducting field interviews and reporting on Burmese conflict resolution traditions, and creating a year-long curriculum for young community leaders. Faye has also worked for the United Nations Development Program, Oxfam International, and Refugees International. And finally, we have Ashwani Vasishth, an associate professor in environmental studies in the School of Social Sciences and Human Services, and director of the Master of Arts in Sustainability Studies at Ramapo College of New Jersey. Ashwani is also a member of the Sustainability Curriculum Consortium's Advisory Council. Ashwani's field is regional ecological planning, with an emphasis in environmental sustainability and international development. He has a bachelor's degree in architecture from the School of Planning and Architecture, Delhi, a master's degree in international development from MIT, and a PhD in environmental planning from the University of Southern California, Los Angeles. Ashwani was an active participant in the stakeholder process that led to the development of the Sustainable Development Goals. And with that, I will turn it back over to our presenters.
Tom, if you can hand it over to Kevin, we can begin.
Great. Hello, everybody. Am I audible?
Sounds great.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Thanks to Ira for the invitation to be part of this webinar. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you and with the other presenters. I'm going to talk to you about strategic planning in the Anthropocene today, and then hopefully I won't be going any further than about 30 minutes or so in this. What we'll be doing today is talking about what is this word, the Anthropocene, the epoch that we're in which we humans are the controlling factor of much of what is the driving processes that are happening on the planet today. What does that mean? In the introduction, planetary boundaries was mentioned. That's sort of a concept that arose because of the Anthropocene. It's a consequence of us being in an epoch where we humans are a controlling factor on the planet. We'll talk a little bit about what that concept is and what it means for how we might want to try to manage the Anthropocene. And then some final thoughts about achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, because they were a huge step forward, but they're a huge challenge as well. So in terms of actually putting them into practice, what might we want to think about from a strategic point of view? So let's start off with the Anthropocene. The term itself was coined by Nobel laureate Paul Crutzen some years back at an IGBP meeting, my old organization, where people were talking about the epoch that we had been in for a long time, the Holocene, which was a stable period after the end of the last ice age. And Paul said, look, we're not in the Holocene anymore. We're in a new epoch, the Anthropocene, where we humans control what's happening on the planet. And that sort of started a big ball rolling in terms of defining what we mean by this. So what I want to do now is, in the next 3 or 4 minutes, take you through all of modern human history. So put your seatbelts on. There's going to be a little turbulence, I think, along the way. What I'm showing here is a graph that comes from, it's a temperature graph. So it comes from measurements made on an ice core that was drilled from Dome Concordia in Antarctica. And the ice core itself goes back 800,000 years, but we're going to look at the last 200,000 years in Earth's history. And so what you see on the y-axis, the vertical axis, is a difference in temperature change from about 150 years ago, roughly pre-industrial conditions. So if it's less than 0, that means it was colder. If it's greater than 0, it means it was warmer than it was in the pre-industrial era. And on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, we see 200,000 at the left end and 0, which is about 150 years ago, roughly at the beginning or middle of the pre-industrial period. And the little dots that you see on the bottom are mileposts in our human development history. So let's go at the left end, where 200,000 years ago, to be a little bit more precise, 198,000 years ago, the oldest skeletal remains of modern humans have been found. They're about 198,000 years ago. Let's call it 200 just for fun. That's how long our species has been around on the planet, us modern humans, Homo sapiens. And as you can see from the temperature, when we modern humans appeared on the Earth scene, the stage, we were sliding into an ice age. The temperature was decreasing. And it decreased to between about 5 and 7 or 8, almost 9 degrees colder than it was pre-industrial. That's an ice age. We were in an ice age for tens of thousands of years. And around about 130,000 years ago, something really interesting happened. It got warm. And this is from one particular core, but we can see the temperature goes up pretty rapidly, and it actually gets a little bit warmer than it was in the pre-industrial period. And it stays that way for about 7,000 to 8,000 years. And then something interesting happens again. It cools off, and we slide once again into another ice age, 5 or 6, 7 degrees colder than it was. Now, we modern humans, though I should have mentioned earlier that those skeletal remains that are 198,000 years old, they were found in what is today Ethiopia. And we modern humans, we hung around the African continent all of that time. We were kind of couch potatoes for millennia, until something interesting happened. And you see there's a temperature dip about 74,000 years ago. And that is coincident with a huge volcanic explosion. Tambora in Sumatra blew up, and it changed the climate globally. It cooled things off. And at that point, something magical happened. We modern humans left the African continent. So what you'll see down at the bottom of the slide is you see Eric's ancestors leave Africa. So my wife and I, we convinced our son Eric to submit a DNA sample to a really cool project that the National Geographic has going on, where you get an analysis of your deep DNA history. Now, my wife is Swedish, I'm American with mostly Irish roots, and we thought, well, this is going to be a challenge for DNA analysis. We'll see if they can trace our ancestry, our common ancestry, through our son. And as it turns out, Eric's ancestors left Africa along the same amount of time that most of us others did. Now, here's a picture I want to frame this a little bit. Here's a picture of the Barcelona football stadium. I'm not sure if any of the participants have been there, but this particular stadium seats about 90,000 people. So one of the questions is how many of us actually left the African continent 74,000 years ago? And if we look at the letters off on the other side of the stadium here, RGUL, it's really tough to pin the exact number down, but the best estimates are that about 10,000 individuals left the African continent, and all of us that don't live off in the African continent are descended from that 10,000 individuals. And that's the number of people that would be seated roughly between R and the first L. So it's pretty sobering. We're all related to those people, all of us, who don't live on the African continent. And that happened, again, where that dark dot is about 74,000 years ago. Now, we kind of spread out relatively quickly. Eric's ancestors reached West Asia about 50,000 years ago, also right in the middle of an ice age. Eric's ancestors, our ancestors, reached Europe about 35,000 years ago or so, still in an ice age. And then something interesting happened. About 10,000 years ago, the Earth warmed up again, and it got to be about the temperature it was roughly pre-industrial. And that's when a couple more interesting things happened. That's when we discovered that we didn't have to be hunters and gatherers anymore. We didn't have to chase antelopes and throw sharpened sticks at them. We didn't have to gather nuts and berries and seeds as we went along. We could sort of settle down, domesticate animals, start growing crops close to where we live. And that's when agriculture started about 9,000 years ago. And all of the great civilizations, Chinese civilizations, Greek civilizations, Mesopotamian civilizations, everybody else, all of those civilizations grew up in this relatively stable, when I say relatively stable, environmental condition. So if you look at the temperature graph, you can see that it does vary. It does go up and down in that period, but to a much lesser extent than it did during the previous 200,000 years. So all of our civilizations have grown up essentially in a relatively stable environmental period. So let's look even farther back in time. This particular data also comes from that same ice core, Dome Concordia, but now we're going 800,000 years back in time. Okay, so this is a scientific plot. Apologize for that. What you see is 8 and then 10 with raised to the power of 5. That's 800,000 years ago. And we go to the same almost present. This is roughly pre-industrial concentration at 0. And what you see plotted on the vertical axis is carbon dioxide concentration. So this is parts per million. So for every million molecules in the air, 800,000 years ago, roughly 200 of them were carbon dioxide molecules. And what you'll see in this 800,000 year, almost 1 million years back in time, carbon dioxide concentration varied between roughly about 170 parts per million to not more than 300 parts per million through that entire period. And what you see is it goes up and down, up and down, up and down 8 times during that period. And those correspond to warm periods when carbon dioxide is high and ice ages when carbon dioxide is low. So what I'm plotting here is a little red line. And when I give this live, I usually ask people, what is the current carbon dioxide concentration? It's 400 parts per million by volume right now. And what I've plotted, that red line that you can see to the right on this curve, is not just a little red line that I've drawn. It's actual data from the Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii. These are continuous measurements of carbon dioxide concentration plotted on the same scale as the ice core data. And you can see that that line is going pretty much straight up, and it's completely outside the natural range of variability for carbon dioxide on our planet, and that's caused by us humans. That's due to burning of fossil fuels and clearing of land and burning material that had been on land. But we tend to fixate on carbon dioxide in the climate game anyway because of the links between CO2 and climate. But that's not the only thing that we humans have been doing since the pre-industrial period. What I'm showing you here is a picture of the nitrogen cycle. on the planet. In 1890, that's the top picture, and 100 years later, 1990, that's the bottom picture. And the arrows show flows of nitrogen from one reservoir to another. And the boxes are the atmosphere. And the different formula that you see there, NOY, N2, and NHX, those are different forms of molecular nitrogen. So most nitrogen is inert, N2. That's what makes up most of the atmosphere around us. And you can see that there's a flow of that nitrogen into what looks like trees and bushes and shrubs. Those are unmanaged natural terrestrial ecosystems. So in 1890, this is sort of in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, most of the flow from the atmosphere was into the terrestrial biosphere, the natural terrestrial biosphere. You can see there's an arrow with 15 next to it. That's going into managed agricultural systems. And you can see arrows going every which way in the diagram, but the most important ones here are that big thick arrow that's going into unmanaged natural terrestrial ecosystems. In 1990, the pictures changed completely. You can still see a pretty big arrow going from the atmosphere, N2, inert nitrogen, into unmanaged natural terrestrial ecosystems. But you see an equally large arrow that's going into both managed systems and into something else, making fertilizer. And that's the result of one single industrial process called the Haber-Bosch process. It's how you make industrial fertilizer, basically. That doubled the amount of nitrogen that's being cycled through the Earth system in that 100-year period. And it's not only elemental cycles like nitrogen and carbon and sulfur, but it's how much land we're occupying and using. This is a plot that comes from about 5 years ago, a publication 5 years ago by John Foley and company. And they're looking at the amount of land that we use for different purposes spread around the globe. And what you see is the green colors represent cropland, and the orange or yellowish colors represent pasture. So cropland is where we're growing wheat and barley and corn and those sorts of things. Pasture is where we have our cattle grazing. And you can see that the intensity of the color is how much of that area, that pixel, is being used for that color. So the most intense means that all of it's being used, and slightly less intense means that some percentage of it is being used for that purpose. And we can see that we're occupying about 40% of the ice-free land surface on our planet, either for crops or for our cattle or sheep. So in terms of the Anthropocene, the epoch in which we humans have a controlling factor, we have moved well outside the envelope of any of our historical experience in terms of our relationship with our planet in a relatively short amount of time. And what do I mean by that? So let's look at some milestones in human population. So I mentioned that the oldest skeletal remains are 198,000 years old. And we reached a population globally of 1 billion modern humans in the year 1804. So it took us 197,000 years to become 1 billion. We doubled that. We reached the population of 2 billion in 1927. My parents were born in 1921 and 1922, respectively. We were 3 billion in 1959. I was born in 1958. So between my parents' generation and mine, we added 1 billion to our billion humans to that global population. We reached 5 billion in 1987, 6 billion in 1999, 7 billion in 2012. So it took us 197,000 years to become 1 billion modern humans, but we've been adding that amount of us modern humans every 15, 13, 14, 15 years since the 1960, basically. What kind of ramifications does that have? So what is the Anthropocene about? This particular picture just shows a lot of graphs. And all of those graphs have the same horizontal axis. It's a time axis going from 1750, about the start of the Industrial Revolution, to 2000. And you can see population at the upper left. You can see GDP, gross domestic product, in the middle at the top row. Down at the almost the right-hand side, third down, McDonald's, restaurants, fertilizer consumption. What you can see in all of these plots is an inflection point, a change, a phase change, right about the end of the Second World War. And that's when, from my point of view anyway, the Anthropocene really started. That's when we humans, there became enough of us, and our collective consumption patterns became impactful enough that we really had a global impact. And that's kind of what you see on this particular picture. This is a lovely image that comes from defense monitoring satellites. And it's looking down at the Earth at night. And we're seeing that we humans have a global impact. We're spread over the entire planet, not evenly. But this can be looked at as our influence globally. But there's a couple of reflections that I take away with me from looking at our history and looking at the planet. And first off is that we are all related. Again, there's only 10,000 modern humans that left the African continent 74,000 years ago, and all of us are descended from them. And in the Anthropocene, we're all neighbors. We are no longer disconnected from each other, neither in terms of communication or in terms of influence. We're all neighbors, close to each other. That changes the way you might want to manage things. So, planetary boundaries. In about 2008-ish, a bunch of people from about 28 different organizations got together and started thinking about what happens when you look at the planet at the planetary scale. Many of us are interested in how things work, and we'll go and we'll look at very small scale processes. My own geeky scientific investigations look at individual cloud droplets and particles that make them. That's pretty small scale. But if you look at the planet and how the planet works on a planetary scale, then all of a sudden interesting things happen. You can start seeing that the planet exhibits some sensitive areas. That if you push the planet a little bit in a particular way, you might get a very, very large change in the way that ecosystems work in the Sahara or in the Amazon, the way that marine ecosystems work, the way that monsoon circulation systems work. And we started looking into whether any of the human activities that we're engaged in might move us into a risk area. That is, that human activities might cause us to move from one stable state from a planetary system to another stable state. And there's a number of characteristics of what they ended up being called planetary boundaries. And they're associated with some sort of large-scale change in how planetary systems work, often in terms of a tipping point, but not always. And these are non-negotiable in the sense that this is the way the planetary system works. One of them is a chemical equilibrium. And no matter how good a negotiator you are, you can't negotiate with a chemical equilibrium. It is what it is. Each one of them has some sort of control variable, as in how much carbon dioxide we emit, how much nitrogen we use, how much fresh water we use. They include some normative aspects of what state we prefer. And our preferred state is that stable environmental condition that all of our societies grew up in, that Holocene stability period, the last 9,000 years roughly. The processes operate on timescales, decades, over which ethics and political action are relevant, and that if we're cognizant of these particular boundaries and stay on the correct side of them, well-being can be created as long as we don't move ourselves into risky territory. So very schematically, you have a control variable, you have a response. That response can change from one state to another. What we've done is we've looked at those particular state changes. Most of them include zones of uncertainty, which can be quite large. And normatively, we'd said, okay, if we can estimate what that zone of uncertainty is, we'll put the boundary on the lower end of that scale. And on that side is our safe operating space. So when we started the analysis, we didn't know what we would run into. It was really going and exploring new territory, and we ended up identifying 9 of these planetary boundaries, these potential tipping points. And we're able to quantify boundaries for 7 of them. And I'll just roughly run through them very quickly. One is climate change. One is ocean acidification, which is basically of all the CO2 that we emit to the atmosphere, about half of it stays there, and about a quarter of it goes into the oceans. And that can change ocean chemistry slowly, or actually quite rapidly, acidifying the oceans. Stratospheric ozone depletion, how much nitrogen and phosphorus we use globally, how much global fresh water we use, how much land we use, and how rapidly the biological diversity on the planet is changing and being lost. There were two that we identified as boundaries, but we couldn't quantify. We didn't have enough good data to actually put a number on these, and that's how much atmospheric aerosol particles, small particles in the air that we generate, and chemical pollution such as hormone disruptors or even radioactive elements that we put into the Earth system. So let's take a look at how the time dependence of these planetary boundaries. And we'll start off in the pre-industrial period. And here you've got all the boundaries on the outside, and you can see sort of a fenced-off area. That's where each one of these relative boundaries are. And in the pre-industrial period, we were right in the middle. We were not even close to any of these planetary boundaries. In the 1950s and 1960s, for the boundaries that we have good data, we were still within all of the planetary boundaries. 1970s and 80s, we were stepping over the nitrogen flow boundary, but still within the others. The 90s to the noughties, we were even further past the nitrogen boundary. We went over the climate change boundary at that point. And the latest data that we have shows that we're over 3, loss of biodiversity, nitrogen flow, and climate change. There's one success story here. It's hard to see, but it's there, and that's ozone depletion. The Montreal Protocol that was signed in the mid-1980s has actually allowed the stratospheric ozone hole to start filling itself in. And there is progress being made there. That's going in the right direction. But in all of the cases, we are either past the boundaries or moving towards them. I'm going to skip over this slide. Just you can please contact me if you're interested in how we actually put numbers on these boundaries. But I want to show you, since I mentioned the ozone hole, what success looks like. This is the Antarctic ozone hole measured in the 24th of October 2015. It's roughly 6 months ago. You can see it's huge. It covers the entire Antarctic continent. This is what success looks like. It's still huge, but it's getting smaller. And it will continue to get smaller into the future. It's going to take decades to repair itself, but it will. And that's one of the few success stories we have. So some final thoughts in finishing up in terms of what this means. We see that we have these planetary boundaries that if we're cognizant of them, and if we remain on the correct side of them, we minimize the risk of flipping into territory that societally we have no history with. But what does it mean in terms of management? What does it mean in terms of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals? No poverty, no hunger, global good health and well-being across the globe. All of these 17 wonderful, inspiring goals. Well, first off, in terms of trying to do something, we all tend to think that the way that things are now is the way they've always been. And that's just not true. And this is a picture that comes from Rochester, New York. It's taken about 100 years ago. This is when my grandparents could have been any of the people in this particular picture. They were about that age at the time. And I'd like you to concentrate and just think a little bit about the transport system that we have today. Mostly gasoline-powered or diesel-powered automobiles on land anyway. And here you see horses and carriages. You see a couple of electrically powered trolleys. You do see a couple of internal combustion engine machines there moving around. But at this particular point, 2 generations ago, it wasn't clear what the dominant transport mechanism would be. And in terms of coming and remaining within planetary boundaries and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, we need to reform completely our transportation, energy, and agriculture sectors. And people will tell you, oh, it's impossible, you can't do it, and you can't do it quickly. Well, we did, and this picture is evidence of that. In 2 generations, we completely transformed the transformation sector. There is no single person alive that is sufficient to resolve today's complex and connected issues. I won't explain where this particular picture comes from, but you'll see one of the participants is Malala Yousafzai, the Nobel laureate and Peace Laureate, Alex Lurtz is a kid, you might say. He started up a number of NGOs, one of which sued the United States government for jeopardizing his generation's future. You see the CEO of the International Red Cross, among others, on the panel. None of those people individually, however talented they might be, is sufficient to solve these problems. We really need each other. We need artists, poets, musicians. We need the faith sector. This is not a challenge that we can achieve without collaboration at a level that we seldom have done before. We need to embrace complexity and really do not try to pretend it doesn't exist. We can't reduce everything down to a Twitter feed. It just doesn't work that way. We have to be able to deal with complexity. And Oliver Wendell Holmes had a wonderful quote. He said, "I would not give a fig for simplicity on this side of complexity, but I'd give my life for the simplicity on the other side of complexity." All of us, I think, are trained in terms of prioritization. Is that you make a list, you put whatever is most important at the top, the next most important thing goes after that, and you work down the list, and you whatever is at the bottom of the list you just ignore. Well, that one thing at a time approach is not the way to approach Anthropocene problem solving. Because things are networked, because they're a complex network, we need a different approach to prioritization. And we need to concentrate on building resilient systems. And I think the SDGs are a lovely expose of that, because they're all related to each other. You won't solve one without working on the others as well. We desperately need better measures of socio-ecological well-being. I don't know if anybody has actually gone and read the report that defines gross domestic product. That's what's in the middle here. It's a report that was written by, among others, Stanley Kuznets, submitted to Franklin D. Roosevelt, and in that report they say, don't use GDP as your only measure of economic wealth and activity. Don't, please, please. And yet that's what we've done. We need better. It's going on. You can see on the right-hand side 2 examples. But this, if we don't measure things correctly, we're not going to move in the right direction. Innovation has to be a lot more than just making a new iPad or a new iPhone. This is a lovely cartoon from Tim Brown's book, Change by Design, where the design thinking and designing a resilient system is a very rich endeavor. And it's not just looking at a product, it's looking at the whole process itself. And finally, we don't have time for pessimism. We need to make these sorts of transformations in a generation, maybe 2 at the outset, at the outside. We need to create a better world as a responsibility to our kids. So let's get started. And my penultimate slide, I'm not a religious person myself, but I derived great solace from the encyclical letter of Pope Francis that came out last year. And there's a lovely quote in it that he wrote, "If we approach nature and the environment without this openness and awe and wonder, if we no longer speak the language of fraternity and beauty in our relationship with the world, our attitude will be that of masters, consumers, ruthless exploiters unable to set limits on their immediate needs. By contrast, if we feel intimately united with all that exists, then sobriety and care will well up spontaneously." That's my hope, and thank you for your attention. I look forward to continued conversation about this on the web system, and if there's any questions, I'll be happy to take them now. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin, for that excellent, extraordinary presentation, and thank you for reminding folks that we will continue the conversation on the Collaborate platform. We have time to take a couple of questions now before we move on to Faye Leone. Jess, did you have any to start off with?
Sure. Thank you again, Kevin. That was really wonderful. I really appreciated your statement that the one thing at a time approach is not the most fitting approach, not the appropriate approach for the complex challenge of sustainability in the Anthropocene. And I think that this speaks to the need for educators to think in systems and teach about systems thinking, and not everyone is familiar with that term, let alone that process, I think. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on, you know, acknowledging that one thing at a time is not the right way to go. What is one first step that educators can take in order to develop systems thinking for themselves as educators in their professional development, as well as for their students and perhaps even on a larger scale for their institutions?
Yeah, thanks. I wish I could give a good answer to that question. For me, simply visualizing the complex nature of systems is a help, and that's why I showed a couple. Well, I didn't talk about them much, but I showed a couple of sort of network diagrams. You got these plates of spaghetti bolognese type of thing with dots and lines that connect them all, and that's a way of trying to visualize what connected systems look like. And if we can make that sort of visualization, I think we all do this without knowing we're doing it. I mean, we all of us have lives, right? You got your kids and you got work and you got to figure out how to make dinner, and we all sort of balance fairly complex systems without really thinking about that's what we're doing. And we all sort of know that one of the ramifications of being in a complex system is there are feedbacks. Is that you get mad at somebody and they get mad back at you, and that makes you even madder at them, and that's a positive amplifying feedback, right? But there are other feedbacks that dampen things out, and those are consequences. Those are basically how complex systems work. There are feedback loops in there, and I think if we can start thinking in those sorts of terms of making our and making the examples that we use in our educational systems more tuned to feedback. And there's an easy one. That's just hold the microphone close to a speaker, right? And you get this squeal really quickly. That's an easy example of an amplifying feedback. Those are the kinds of ones that we want to avoid. We'd rather have stabilizing feedbacks. So I wish I could give you a good answer on how we might want to embed this in our education system. But I think we do, but we don't think about it. And maybe if we thought about it a little more, and maybe if we sort of had this picture in our head of, instead of a linear, you build something, you use it, and you throw it away, that sort of linear model, that we simply create a feedback and think of more of systems in terms of their feedback. That's the first step.
Actually, that's a great response, Kevin, because it gives me the opportunity to explain how this process works. Jess is going to go onto the Collaborate platform, and she's going to post the question that she asked of you. We'll summarize your initial response, and we will invite all the participants who have registered for this series to offer their examples on how they best can convey it from their own in-the-classroom experience. So thank you, Kevin. I know that you can't stay with us till the end of the full webinar today, but we're going to look for you online and appreciate your contribution to this today. With that, I think, Tom, if you could shift the presenter mode over to Faye, we can give Faye her segment here, and while you're doing that, let me reassure everyone that we do have 3 excellent presenters today, and we are not under any time pressure to sign off at the end of 90 minutes. I don't want our presenters to rush. I want to make sure that they are able to convey what they want to convey about the Anthropocene, planetary boundaries, and the Sustainable Development Goals. And so with that, a special thanks to the head of the IISD reporting services, Kimo Gore, who would have liked to have been here himself today, but Kimo has arranged for Faye to give us an overview by the IISD reporting services of the Sustainable Development Goals. We will start with the basics presented by Faye, and then we'll move on to Ashwani's presentation. Faye.
Great, thanks, Ira. I think everybody can see my first slide. Now I'm just going to see if you can see me as well. Can everyone see me? Okay.
Yes.
Can you also still see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. And I know that you can hear me. Thanks a lot for having me, Ira. This has been wonderful already. I loved Kevin's presentation. I'm going to remember some of those visuals for a long time, I think. And also the ending on the ozone layer, a bit of optimism. I also love that example. And to bring back something that Jess raised, this idea that we can't just do one thing at a time, it reminds me of something else, something that's often said at the UN by governments: don't just give us a one-size-fits-all solution. Now we have another lesson: don't just do one thing at a time. And I think this really speaks to synthesizing the interlinked nature of the SDGs, and those really do indeed require us to do many, many things at once. So I'm going to dive in on giving you a little bit of an overview about the SDGs. And hopefully this will give you, as educators, a starting point on how to explain the SDGs to students, and also why, including why they are significant, why they should be part of our curricula going forward. So again, my name is Faye Leone. I'm with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and I work in New York with the Reporting Services Division, which is focused on reporting out from intergovernmental negotiations that are happening at the UN. And we have two main services or products that we use to share the information that we gather. The first is the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, and this is the publication that most people are most familiar with. It's the very detailed, comprehensive, and neutral summary that we write from major conferences and COPs, like a climate COP. We covered the SDG Summit in September at the UN. So sort of big moments like this on the international level, that's what the ENBs give a record of. And then we also have something that we call our knowledge bases. And this is a series of websites which are structured more like a blog. It's not just a report, it's a daily, it's updated daily or almost daily, and we cover everything that we can round up from what the UN system and the broader international community is doing on sustainable development. So, and I'm the editor of the Sustainable Development Policy and Practice website, which is one of those websites. So these are a couple ways that we get out as much information as possible in as useful a package as possible, and we hope that it will also be useful for you in your teaching. Okay, so you see my first slide, and this is a new methodology for me using a slideshow over a webinar, so apologies if I have some technical hitches. Do you now see my second slide?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So this is the major areas I'm going to cover, as helpfully suggested by Ira when he invited me to give this presentation. So the genesis of the SDGs, where the mandate comes from for governments who have come up with these, the structure of the goal set and the broader agenda that they're part of, the 2030 agenda, a couple of political dynamics that characterize the SDGs and make them a little bit unique, the outcome of the negotiation process, what we have now before us, and then just a note on bringing the SDGs to life, which is we're in year one of that. Okay, so genesis and mandate. So the mandate for the SDGs came from two separate sources originally. First, the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, as everyone knows, were a 15-year agenda. They ran from 2000 to 2015, and so at the end of 2015, they were set to expire, and in preparation for this process, about 3 or 4 years before that expiry date, the UN system and government started to think about what what they would do as a framework for the development agenda once that goal set ran out. And so there was a lot of talk about renewing, creating like an MDG plus that would sort of extend the MDGs into the future for another series of years. So this was sort of one stream that was on the table. The second is that at Rio Plus 20, the UN Conference on Sustainable Development, which of course took place in Rio in 2012, governments, after extensive negotiations, agreed to call for a set of sustainable development goals to be established, to be negotiated and created and set out. So we had these two streams, but a question still remained, which is, would these two mandates lead to one and the same agenda, or would there be a set of MDG plus goals, and that to finish the unfinished business of the MDGs, and then alongside that a set of sustainable development goals, or would the development agenda, as guided by the MDGs for the past 15 years, be expanded to include all three dimensions of sustainable development and make a really three-dimensional goal set the guiding framework for the international development community? So what is the answer to this question that was very mysterious and suspenseful at the time? On paper, the answer is the latter, that the two tracks merged. So the MDGs expired at the end of 2015 and the SDGs took effect to pick up where the MDGs left off, finishing their unfinished business, so to speak, and also expanding the ambition to cover so social development, economic development, and environmental protection. So that's sort of on paper and what is agreed technically. But in the negotiating rooms, where the discussions take place now on bringing the SDGs to life, it can feel a little bit like that battle is still being fought. I would say there has been a shift, and I would say it's to a pleasantly surprising extent that most governments do now see sustainable development as the way to achieve the change they want. Long-lasting development that reaches all parts of society and engages all actors, not just governments and aid organizations. So I think that is the predominant view now from what I hear in the rooms. But there is still this view, less popular now as time has gone by, but still voiced by some, that environmental protection is something that follows poverty eradication, that you do only when you can afford it. So now some of that is, I would say, not truly believed, but a form of posturing or a political tactic to bolster the case for aid for richer countries. The question of whose responsibility the national development agenda is, and that's both from a historical perspective, but where blame lies for the state that many countries are in, and also just the plain facts of where the money is today. So I think that there has been a shift towards sustainability as the guiding framework for development, and to the extent that that's not totally agreed, there's also an opportunity to, if the financing and the resourcing can be worked out, to get everyone truly on that page. Okay, I'm going to move to the next topic, which is process. So I don't want to spend too long on this because I don't think it's terribly interesting anymore. It was very interesting at the time. But there were the two tracks had to merge, right? The MDG track and the mandate to create sustainable development goals. So there was a very long process. There was the open working group on the SDGs, which lasted about 18 months. And this was led by the ambassadors to the UN from Kenya and from Hungary. And they were pretty amazing to those of us who watched them up close. Some of you may have been in the rooms as well. And this created sort of a suggested or proposal set of SDGs, and then another process, about a year-long process, picked up where that left off starting in late 2015. That was called the post-2015 agenda negotiations. And that sort of took the proposed goal set of 17 goals, and I think there were 169 targets already at that point. And it said, what else do we need to put around this goal set to make it a full agenda? And so they added a political declaration in the beginning. The 17 goals and the 169 targets were like confirmed and tweaked a little bit to make them as measurable as possible. Then they added a big chapter on means of implementation, which incorporated the outcome of the Financing for Development conference that took place in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, also in July 2015. And then finally a chapter on follow-up and review, which is the sort of politically safe language for monitoring, evaluation, assessment, accountability, that sort of thing. So this is what now comprises the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, with the SDGs sort of as the centerpiece. The Open Working Group and the post-2015 negotiation process were incredibly inclusive as processes relative to how the MDGs were formulated and how most intergovernmental negotiations had worked until that point. And many processes now look back at the OWG and say, let's use those modalities, those ways of working, and let more people into the conversation as we're negotiating, not just let's improve communication and webcast out of the room and let people see what we're doing, but actually let people have a voice while it's being negotiated. We tend to believe that the reason that the co-chairs, Ambassadors Kamau and Karosi, and then Kamau and Donahue for the post-2015 year, the reason that they made sure that so many stakeholders could be part of the process was because of the recognition that the UN and the member states, the governments, were going to need a lot of help to fulfill the new agenda that they wanted to set out and the level of aspiration they really wanted to get to. And that a lot of people were going to be needed to be involved from the beginning in order to create the necessary sense of ownership, make it a truly multi-stakeholder process. The kinds of stakeholders and actors that are needed now, and so were brought in earlier on, include civil society, business, and different levels of government, not just the national representatives who have a voice at the UN formally. Okay, I'm moving to our next slide, which is a couple of the political dynamics. These are, I would say, part of what make the SDGs special and what governments hoped would make them transformative. So the first is universality, and this is part of the trend of saying that aid isn't just from the north to the south, from developed to developing, and some of us have it all figured out and others need a lot of help. We'll help them, and then that'll be our international relationship. That's sort of no longer the way that anybody wants to talk about development at the UN. So the idea of universality is that every country has a lot of work to do, and it's definitely challenging to see if you take each of the 17 goals, which that reminds me, I'm going to show them to you now, but if you take each of the 17 goals, it can be hard to see how every country needs to work on them equally. And then there are a couple that really are a good example of why you need richer countries to work just as hard as poorer countries, like on sustainable consumption and production. This is when we're waste and the kind of consuming that we do and how high I'm running my air conditioner right now and all of that are where we really have a clear burden that we need to work on. Before I go on, I'm going to pull up the goals. Kevin showed them as well, and I know that you all have seen them many times, but in case you'd like to have a visual and refresh your memory. Yes, I have a lot of tabs open. Everyone reminds me of this all the time. Let's see. And then I'm going to show you IISD's version of these as well. So here's the Wikipedia page on the goals. And so these are sort of the communications friendly names for them. These are not the negotiated names. These are very snappy names compared to what is in the document. But in the beginning, you can kind of see these as very coherent with the MDGs, like they look familiar. No poverty, no hunger, good health, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation. And then we start getting into what are called like emerging issues or sort of the current challenges. So we have renewable energy, good jobs and economic growth, innovation and infrastructure. Number 10, reduced inequalities. This was one of the very contested goals. This is definitely new territory for an internationally agreed agenda. And to link inequality with development was difficult politically. Then we get to 11, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption. That's the one that I mentioned, or as we call it SCP, sustainable consumption and production. That may be how more of you are familiar with that concept. Climate action, life below water, that's the oceans goal. Life on land, that's sort of terrestrial biodiversity, forests, mountains, and land degradation and desertification. Goal 16 is the other one that was very hard to get into the goal set, peace and justice. So this is about political stability, dealing with conflict and fragility, rule of law, access to justice. It was very contested how to depict the linkage between governance and peace and development. Which one is a driver of the other? Does it matter? Aren't they both, aren't they all in a cycle and we can just reflect it here? But it was very difficult for some governments to accept putting a governance element into a development agenda. And part of that, according to our research and conversations, was a concern that governance criteria would become conditions for aid and partnership. And then goal 17 is partnerships for the goals, and this is also the financing goal, and about making sure that we have enough resources to let everyone, every government have the resources they need to implement the 17 goals or the other 16 goals. Okay, so let me go back to my slides. Okay. Another political dynamic in the agenda is leaving no one behind. This was really in focus the past couple weeks at the UN. There was the high-level political forum, which is the structure now that's going to be used to check in on how the SDGs are progressing each year. And the theme this year was ensuring that no one is left behind. And this is a very, very challenging and potentially very useful component of the agenda that is a way of saying that none of these goals or their targets are going to be considered achieved until they're achieved for the lowest economic layer of the population. And there's different ways of defining that, what I not very officially described it as a lower layer. So there's different vocabulary around that different governments prefer. But it's something that sets it apart really from the MDGs, where you could sort of point to averages as progress, and now there's this idea that that's not going to be enough anymore. We need to reach everybody that could not be reached under the MDGs, and every effort that was made under the MDGs, wherever it didn't succeed, that's exactly where the next development agenda needs to focus. Okay, so now we are on bringing the SDGs to life. I would actually like to talk a little bit about the targets and the indicators. And then this will kind of close us out. So, okay, so global versus national achievement. The SDGs refer to global aggregates. I'm going to show you some examples of targets and indicators because that's the piece of the goal set that really gets down to, are we making progress, and how are we even defining progress? I mean, you saw SCG 12 is called responsible consumption. Let's look at what that is supposed to mean in practice. So I'm going to again take you on a really fun tour of my computer. Okay, so this document that I think you can see in front of you now is, started at the top. This is the agreement that's been reached. It was reached earlier this year by a body at the UN called the UN Statistical Commission, which reports to the Economic and Social Council and the UN General Assembly. And the Statistical Commission set up a working group. It's there at the top of the document, the Interagency and Expert Group on Sustainable Development Indicators. And what this group, which is nicknamed the IAEG, what they did was they negotiated among their membership, which was made up of national statisticians from about 28 countries, I believe. And they came up with indicators that they believe are the best way to measure each of the goal's 169 targets. And then they did not open them up for political discussion at the whole intergovernmental level, which was not the UN delegates who were not part of that process were not happy to not be part of that process. They wanted to take it from the technical hands into the political hands and really make sure that they liked the way that each of these 169 targets were going to be defined. But that's not what's happening. So this is a technical process, and you can ignore the scrolling. I'm just trying to get us to the part where we see how each target is going to be measured. And I'm actually very interested in to see if any of you have comments on what you make of these indicators. So goal 1, end poverty in all its forms everywhere. We'll just start at the top. By target 1.1, so goal 1 has 5 substantive targets, 1.1 through 1.5, and it's followed by 2 targets A and B, which are on the means of implementation. So this is about financing the previous targets, the substantive targets. So the first target of the first goal is by 2030 eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere, currently measured as people living on less than $1.25 a day US. And that target has one indicator. If you look to the right, 1.1.1. So we measure 1.1 by proportion of the population below the international poverty line, disaggregated by sex, age group, employment status, and geographical location, whether they're urban or rural. And so this is the internationally agreed, on the technical side, way of defining whether we're succeeding at eradicating extreme poverty for all people everywhere. Now I'm going to take us down. I'll show you goal 12 because I mentioned it, and also because it connects a bit to some of what Kevin talked about with chemical boundaries and that sort of thing. So goal 12, ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. So I like 12.3. I mentioned food waste before. By 2030, have per capita global food waste at the retail and consumer levels, and reduce food losses along production and supply chains, including post-harvest losses. And the way that will be measured, global food loss index. To me, that doesn't sound like a number or an amount, but this is like as good as they could do, and with an awareness that not all of these are perfect, and they'll sort of see how it goes and then tweak where the indicators are not adequate. Let me look at one on chemicals. So 12.4, and I'll stop with this one. By 2020, achieve the environmentally sound management of chemicals and all wastes through their life cycle, etc. And then 12.4 actually has 2 indicators. One's on the number of parties to MEAs on hazardous and other chemicals and waste. And a second indicator for target 12.4 is treatment of waste, generation of hazardous waste management by type of treatment. So you can see how varied the indicators are. There are different types of indicators. And I wanted to also let you know where the process stands now on the indicators, which is to sort of work on the indicators that don't have good methodologies behind them and also don't have data available within each government. And they're also, the IAG is still, it still exists, it's still working. They're going to meet in October, I believe in Addis Ababa again, and work to set up a plan to revise the indicators over time when they don't live up to the ambitions of the targets they're associated with. So those are about global aggregate achievement. How that global aggregate will be sort of divvied up among the countries, the national governments that all have to contribute is a little bit of a fuzzy area, and I think a real area of, like, there's a lot of space for working on that question, and there are a lot of different projects and initiatives that seek to say, for X goal, here's how the work that needs to be done can be divided up among governments or among businesses, large companies that are players in this area. So I think that's a very interesting activity that's going to be going on for the next few years.
And of course, Faye, we can get into further details on the goals, targets, and indicators and their interrelationships in the follow-on dialogue on Collaborate. So I think that before ending, it would be good to talk a bit about utilizing IISD's publications and resources from a faculty perspective.
Great. Thanks, Ira. That brings me to the last slide, which is just a list of our key resources that I hope will be useful to all of you. So the website, I'm going to show it to you now live, that I work on, Sustainable Development Policy and Practice, and the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, which I'll also take you through live, and our IISD website. And then, of course, please contact me with any specific questions, or we can use the Collaborate platform. So just to show you those websites, we have, this is our knowledge base, Sustainable Development Policy and Practice. We have guest articles. We have policy updates written by our editors and experts. And we have organized, I'm going to show you our version of each goal. We've organized our work now so that you can search by goal and find all the coverage that we've done by goal. So here are recent stories, reverse chronological order on gender equality, for example, goal 5.
Very good.
And lastly,
let me just ask, we had a little bit of background noise that's interrupting, so if someone needs to be on mute, let's go back on mute. Go ahead.
This is my last note just to show you this website. This is where you can find the Earth Negotiations Bulletins. It's IISD.ca, and it starts meetings we're doing now. And then if you scroll down, you get to the ones that have just passed, and then at the end, the ones that are coming up. And let me know if you're looking for something and you can't find it. This website is being overhauled, and I hope that will be sooner rather than later. It's difficult, but let me know if you need help finding a certain report. That's it. Thanks so much for having me, and I'm looking forward to everyone's questions and comments.
Hey, let me quickly ask you a question because we need to move on to Ashwani, and then we hope that you and the IISD team will be able to join us on the Collaborate platform with follow-up dialogue. Just on a basic process issue, the next webinar in this series is going to be on the Paris Agreement. So my question is that one of the SDGs, is, number 13, is on climate. How did at just a basic procedural level, how did the SDG process take into account the Paris COP, which was still going to happen after the conclusion of the SDGs?
That's right. It was very complicated for the exact reasons you mentioned. What they ended up doing was putting in a placeholder until the Paris COP happened, and then adding references to it because there was a strong feeling, especially from countries that were really clinging on to the idea of common but differentiated responsibility, that Paris was that the UNFCCC forum is the only place they were comfortable negotiating climate issues. So this was not reopened. There was not a separate negotiation on climate for the SDGs.
Very good, Faye. Thank you very much. I think that provided an excellent background for people who were not familiar with the SDG process and then some, and a perfect segue to Ashwani's further comment on the SDGs. So, Tom, I'm going to ask you to shift the presenter role over to Ashwani, and we need to ensure we get some of that background noise muted.
Thank you, Ira. Appreciate that. Thank you, Faye. That was a fabulous introduction to process and really made a difference to folks' understanding, I'm sure. Kevin, too, set the stage very well. I'm going to try to do two things in my process. Ira, could I ask how much time do I have? It's now 3:20.
Yeah, we can go beyond the bottom of the hour. As I wrote to you, I don't want you to rush. We all want to hear your perspective on the SDGs, and if people need to log off at the bottom of the hour, they know the recording will be available. So let's get your fullest thoughts, Ashwani.
Well, fullest thoughts will probably have to wait for the collaborate process. But I'll do a brief overview of what I think are critical pieces of this. So what I want to look at is the Sustainable Development Goals in the context of teaching. How do you teach them? What are they? How do you teach them? What is it that is necessary to consider them in a fruitful way in academia? What I want to do, it's not giving me control. Okay, I got it. So most of you are probably familiar with this whole process, so I'm just going to skim over it. But since 1972, every 10 years, there has been a summit of some kind within the UN system that is focused on nature or ecology or something like that, starting with 1972, the UN Conference on the Human Environment, 1982, the UN World Charter for Nature, 1992, the Earth Summit, 2002, Johannesburg, and then 2012, Rio Plus 20. Interspersed in this 10-year cycle are a few seminal reports or events that we need to take account of. The first of them, which I'm sure everyone here is familiar with, is Our Common Future, the Brundtland Commission report, the Millennium Development Goals, which I will spend a few minutes on in a couple of minutes, and then the culmination of the MDGs and the initiation of the SDGs. And then I'll close with a brief sketch of how I think we can teach these goals. So 87, the Brundtland Commission report rejects the model of conventional development, recognition that the way in which we're doing development around the world is not really giving us what we thought the outcomes would be, and that we are taking from nature in ways that is unsustainable. 1992, the Rio Declaration, some of you may actually have been there for the Earth Summit, is the place where humans get put at the center of our concern with sustainable development, the assertion that all people are entitled to a healthy and productive life in harmony with nature, and calls for the development of sustainable human settlements. Marks the Agenda 21. There's a number of pieces of this that are worth keeping in mind as we move into the SDGs, and I'll try to touch on them later on. 2000, the Millennium Development Goals get put in place. Most of you may be familiar with these, but I just run through the 8. Eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, achieve universal primary education, promote gender equality and empower women, and reduce child mortality, improve maternal health, combat HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, ensure environmental sustainability, and a global partnership for development. So there's mixed views on whether the MDGs really were useful, they worked, did they do what they set out to do. I tend to be an evolutionary theorist in the sense that I believe having them is more important than not having them, and the outcomes will follow over time, and we will see the full impact of these perhaps a few years down the road. 2002 is the Johannesburg Summit. If you go to the resources page in Collaborate, I've put up some documents there, including Wolfgang Sachs' wonderful memo at the Johannesburg Summit on equity that is worth looking at. Then 2012 comes around, Rio Plus 20, the future we want. Coming out of that really is this whole move from the MDGs to the SDGs. Getting beyond 2015 becomes a growing concern. And then 2015 comes around and you get the actual Sustainable Development Goals. 17 of them. Lot of debate about how many there should be. The US tried to put its foot down. That foot was moved very quickly, and we ended up with 17 goals. I'm going to go through this text version very briefly to highlight what the range of issues that is being considered in the Sustainable Development Goals before I get into how we might go about teaching them. So of the 17 goals, end poverty in all forms everywhere, end hunger, ensure healthy lives, ensure inclusive and equitable quality education, achieve gender equality, water and sanitation for all, energy for all, decent work for all, build resilient infrastructure, foster innovation, reduce inequality, which Faye has pointed out has a whole bunch of other layers attached to it that we can unpack over time. Number 11, cities and human settlements, sustainable consumption and production, combat climate change, ocean, seas, and marine resources, protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, justice for all, and strengthen the means of implementation. Conceptually, what this boils down to is 17 goals that attempt to capture the thinking in all the rooms at the United Nations and outside where this conversation happened. There was a lot of jockeying for importance, a lot of jockeying for what needed to be considered and what could be subsumed. The argument was made by some that discrete goals were a disservice, that what we needed was a matrix that interlinked these goals and looked at the interstices between them, and I'll get into that a little bit in a few minutes. Which brings me really to the meat of what I want to talk about, which is teaching the SDGs. When you think about the process of teaching sustainable development, there are a few lessons that we have learned over the years, I believe. There's a substantial body of literature on teaching sustainable development that we need to draw on in teaching the Sustainable Development Goals and how we think about them. There are some precursor issues. Before you actually get to the goals, there's a few things that you have to think about. And the first of these, of course, is without argument, worldview. How do you think about the world before you begin to think about the world? That's really the issue here. And there's some wonderful readings that can be used to get at this piece of it. I'll use two examples to talk about worldview and why I think they're important. The first of these has to do with this obsession that we have from engineering for solving problems. That if you meet a problem, then your intuitive reaction is to look for a way of solving that problem. And my argument is, and I think Kevin's argument for complexity bears this out quite well, that if you look at the world as a complex system, problems don't get solved, they get engaged. We can engage with problems, but we can't solve them because they will move as we intervene upon them. To give you just one reflection on this, there's a wonderful article by Crawford Holling, Buzz Holling, that talks about the engineering view and the ecological view of problems. And what he's saying is that the engineers tend to solve problems, ecologists tend to engage with problems. My background's in planning, regional sustainability planning, and there is a wonderful article that some of you may be familiar with, which I will put into the resources section in Collaborate, called Dilemmas in a General Theory of Planning. The argument there really is, by Rittel and Weber, is that there are two kinds of problems in the world. There are tame problems, they say, and there are wicked problems. Tame problems are solvable problems. They're engineering problems, they're mechanical problems. Two people sit down with the same problem, they will solve it in fairly similar kinds of ways and come to the same conclusion. There will be an agreeable point at which we can say, this problem has been solved, we can now move on to the next. That's the world of tame problems. Fortunately for us, many of the problems that we face in everyday life are tame problems. So we're able to solve them, and we're able to make progress, and we're able to, in fact, evolve socially and culturally in ways that we would not be able to without solving problems. But then Rittel and Weber say there's this second class of problems, wicked problems, which are a whole different ball of wax, and they have to be approached in a very different way. I won't get into the details of it. Suffice it to say that reality is multiple, that there's more than one thing going on at the same place at the same time, that what you see of reality is a function as much of your perspective, your purpose. Why you're looking will tell you far more about what you see than the act of seeing itself. Which brings me to the second piece of the worldview, which is our idea of reality as being morphological. We trust the empirical senses. We trust that if we can taste something or see something or touch something, it's more real than something that's in our mind. Breaking from that view of reality is a necessary precursor to engaging with sustainable development, it seems to me. And then we can get into the whole idea of a systems approach and what it means to take a systems approach to something like the Sustainable Development Goals. And the third piece of it is integration, the ability to connect things. There's a statement that was made about complexity. So the question is, how do you know when a system is more complex than another system? Some people have argued that it's very simple. You look at the number of parts, and if it has more parts, it's more complex. Turns out that's not the case. In fact, it's about relationships. So if you look at a circuit diagram, boxes and arrows, we take the boxes to be real, and we take the arrows to be conceptual. In an ecological view, it's the obverse. The boxes are conceptual. The entities, objects, and events that we take to be real because of our sensory biases are constructs, social constructs. What's real is the relationships, the arrows. And if we begin to take this view of the goals, then the goals themselves are placeholders. They are constructs that we have created to capture a set of complex symptoms, indicators, conditions, so on and so forth. What really matters is the relationship across the goals. And that's what I'm going to spend a little bit of time on a couple of slides down. Then there's the integral issues, the issues integral to the Sustainable Development Goals themselves. And again, if you look at the readings that I've put up in the resources section, you'll get a better sense of what I'm talking about. There's the whole issue of governance. How do you govern Sustainable Development Goals that apply not just to developing countries, but to developed countries as well? There's a huge debate about this. Faye alluded to it when she said that not all the goals apply to all the countries. Respectfully, I think that that may not be the case. I think some goals apply more to some cases than to other cases, but this is not a function of developed and developing. In fact, those of you following the news may have heard that fairly recently the World Bank has disavowed the use of those two words, developed and developing, and is beginning to look for a new vocabulary to talk about the state of affairs in the world at present. So how do you govern under these circumstances becomes a huge question, particularly when you have levels of organization, nested levels of organization, where you have to talk about what is at the global level, at the national level, at the subnational level, at the local level, and all the nuances that come with these kinds of divisions. There has to be some idea of subsidiarity. There has to be some idea that decisions need to be made, because after all, at the end of the day, governance is about making decisions. And governance needs to devolve to the level at which the results of those decisions will most manifest themselves, becomes the argument here. So the whole issue of governance is something that we can spend a few degree programs talking about. Means of implementation and financing, we've talked about these as well. Common but differentiated responsibilities, common but differentiated governance. The argument is that the goals should be common, but the responsibilities may be differentiated. That governance may be, the goals may be common, but governance may need to be differentiated. These are all things that can get unpacked as we proceed down the line. And then there's the implicative issues. What do you do with the Sustainable Development Goals once you've understood them and their interrelationships and connections and relationships? One piece of this, of course, is about localization. That we need to take these universal goals and particularize them to context. By local, I don't mean just geographically local, but functionally local. So, for instance, a city may decide to take the Sustainable Development Goals and appropriate them for its own use. I believe, I'm not absolutely positive about this, but I believe Baltimore is one of the cities that has tried to do this. So contextualization becomes a huge piece of this. Where are you trying to apply the goals? How would you begin to apply them? What would you do in order to make sure that they actually belong to the context in which you are talking about them? And then there's the issue of systems integration. There's a number of ways we can cut this. I picked this from a blog post that I came across because it talks about an issue that is clearly cross-cutting in its implications. Water and the Sustainable Development Goal Framework for Collaboration. So you have the 17 goals, and you look at them from within what Lakoff calls the frame of water. So what does water have to say about poverty? What does water have to say about health, nutrition, hunger, so on and so forth? What does water have to say about education and you begin to look at each of the goals from within the frame of one of the other goals that is imperative as a cross-cutting theme. You can do this kind of work with many of the goals, not all of them, because it doesn't work as well. But I think if we are to be teaching the Sustainable Development Goals in a meaningful way, then this is the kind of work that we need to be doing. I really look forward to the collaborators part of this process where we can unpack some of these ideas a little more, and we can begin to talk about how we do this integration work and how we begin to look at the Sustainable Development Goals as interrelated elements rather than as 17 discrete objects. I'll stop at that. Thank you.
And thank you, Ashwani, for that excellent proposed framework for teaching faculty to use in conveying the significance of the Sustainable Development Goals. I also appreciate the fact that you've helped us explain the follow-on intent with the facilitated dialogue on the Collaborate platform, and we're looking forward to your active involvement in that. I will ask Tom Bauman and Jess Guerrier if we have one or two quick questions before we move to closing.
This is Jess. Tom, before I ask a question, are there any from our participants?
The questions that I've seen one, and it's referring to the resources that Ashwani has referred to on Collaborate, and just the interest to access those quickly. So it's not an immediate question on the presentation overall.
And the generic answer to that question is we will get all of the documents that Ashwani has kindly identified for us posted in the resources section. What's up there at the moment so far is the initial set of background readings that we pulled together, including some but not all of the ones that Ashwani has recommended, but we will get that up there quickly. Jess, your question?
Well, I don't know if this is a short question or not, but Ashwani, I was really interested in your last slide about implicative issues, and you listed 3: localization, contextualization, and systems integration. And it seems to me, from an educator standpoint, that these really seem to be where higher education institutions and higher ed as a sector can be of best use or highest use. And so the question is, what are your thoughts on the ways in which educators might be in a position to facilitate those processes, whether it's through research or teaching or collaboration with community or industry or with policy groups? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Jess. So the really short answer to that is yes.
That's great.
Okay. However, it seems to me that there's a few things we need to do before we can actually, in my view, before we can actually meaningfully begin to engage with something as complex as the Sustainable Development Goals and their implications for human development. One of these has to do with disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity or supradisciplinarity, whatever you want to call it. We need to rethink how we teach. I believe this very passionately in the context of the university. I'll give you one example, and this is only because I've been struggling with this issue for some time, and so I'm not presenting this as a success story but as an experiment in process. I teach at a state college, and this is Ramapo College. It is in New Jersey, and it's a small state college, about 6,000 students. It's a liberal arts, primarily undergraduate with a few graduate programs, and it has 5 schools. There's ASB business school, there's this the theoretical and applied sciences, there's social sciences, there's international development and AIS, and there's communication arts. We have majors, and these majors are housed within schools, and they're very disciplinary in their approach. You have sociology and psychology and environmental studies and so on and so forth. And for a while I struggled really hard to take the general education component of this and use that to infuse sustainability across the curriculum so that everybody coming through the college was exposed to this complex set of ideas that I thought important. More recently, I've had the opportunity to initiate a all-college major in sustainability. So I'm drawing faculty from every school to teach in the sustainability major. I'm not saying this is necessarily the answer, but this is the problem that we have to struggle with, is how do we break the disciplinary boundaries that make Kevin's work over there and Faye's work over there and my work over here and all the other disciplinary chunks of this scattered around. How do we begin to integrate this in some way? And I do believe that academia is being dragged kicking and screaming to a point where it needs to do this. And I do believe that the process of trying to teach the SDGs in a savvy way will lead us very quickly to that transdisciplinary, superdisciplinary kind of world. I don't know if that answers your question, Jess.
That's a wonderful starting point. Thank you.
Well, and I think that that's a very poignant and appropriate close to this session. I want to thank Kevin and Faye and Ashwani for sharing their experience and insights with us today. I look forward to seeing all the participants on the Collaborate platform as we continue to discuss these issues and more. If you have any questions or feedback on this webinar, the full online dialogue series, or Sustainability Curriculum Consortium activities, please write to us at curriculumforsustainability@gmail.com. And finally, my thanks to my colleagues Jess Guerrier and Tom Bauman for doing such a great job in pulling together this webinar. With that, we're signing off for today. Thank you very much.
By the way, Ira, before you close, and on behalf of participants, thank you, Ira, for organizing this.
Thank you, Ashwani.
Thanks, Ira. I enjoyed participating very much.
Thank you.